It is somewhere around the year 700 AD. A merchant from Samarkand is arguing about the price of indigo. He is standing in the western market of Chang'an, one of two vast trading floors at the heart of the Tang Dynasty's capital, surrounded by 40,000 shops selling 200 kinds of goods. He doesn't think of himself as standing at the center of the world, but he is. The phrase for shopping in Mandarin today, Mai Dongxi, literally means buying east and west. East market, west market, these two markets, right here. The language has been carrying this city's memory for 13 centuries without anyone noticing. Around him, the city breathes. A Zoroastrian priest moves through the crowd toward a fire temple 3 streets away. A Turkish military officer, step-born, Tang commissioned, walks in the other direction, wearing the uniform of an empire that recruited talent regardless of where it came from. A Japanese monk, 2 years out from a sea crossing that nearly killed him, is somewhere in the Buddhist quarter, beginning a decade of study he will carry home to reshape Japanese civilization. A woman passes in Central Asian dress, not because she has to, but because Chang'an at its height was so confident in itself, so hungry for the world beyond its walls, that its own people dressed like foreigners by choice. This is a city of close to 1 million people, the largest on Earth, and it is only the beginning of what this story is about. In the palace district before the morning court session, an official is rehearsing arguments he will present to the emperor. Arguments about tax reform, military restructuring, and the price of grain in the northern provinces. He rose through no inherited title. He passed an examination, a brutal years-long gauntlet of classical learning and analytical writing, open in theory to any man in China regardless of birth. A system of selecting leaders by pure intellectual merit so radical, so far ahead of anything the Western world has imagined, that Britain will not attempt something comparable for another 800 years. What that system built and what it quietly destroyed is a story we will get to. Somewhere near the city's quieter edge, in a Taoist monastery, a monk is grinding a powder. Charcoal, sulfur, saltpeter, a pale crystalline salt found on dunghills and cave walls. He is not building a weapon. The thought has not crossed his mind. He is searching for the elixir of immortality, as Taoist monks have been doing for generations, convinced that the right combination of minerals and intention will unlock the secret of eternal life. He will not find it. What he finds instead will reshape warfare, mining, and the political map of the entire world. But that is later. Right now, he is just a monk in the dark, looking for something he will never find. Across the city, in the entertainment wards that stay open past the curfew bells, a poet is drinking wine he cannot afford, watching the lanterns come on in the ward across the wall. His name is Du Fu. He does not know yet that the empire he loves, this empire, this city, this particular quality of light, is perhaps 30 years from catastrophe. He does not know that he will spend the last decades of his life as a refugee, yet writing some of the most devastating poetry in the Chinese language about what it feels like to watch a civilization come apart from the inside. Right now, he is just watching the lanterns, thinking, reaching probably for more wine. This is the Tang Dynasty at its height. What follows it, the Song Dynasty that rises from its ashes 2 centuries later, will be in some ways even more astonishing. Smaller, militarily weaker. And yet the Song will produce the world's first paper money, its first permanent navy, its first recognizably modern economy. A civilization whose GDP at its height accounted for roughly 1/3 of everything produced on Earth. A dynasty that a Moroccan geographer, writing in 1154, described with barely contained disbelief, its ships, its markets, and its cities of 1 million people, in a report that his European readers assumed was exaggeration. It was not exaggeration. And at the center of it all, at the center of the Tang, specifically at the moment of its greatest confidence, there is a woman. She has no title yet, in this year, in this city. She is not yet what she will become, but she is already watching, already learning the precise grammar of power in a world that was not built for her. What she does with that knowledge is the most improbable story this video will tell. This is the story of medieval China, not the vague pageant of dynasties that most Western educations offer, but the living, breathing, inventing, arguing, collapsing, rising reality of the most sophisticated civilization on Earth during the centuries the West still calls its Dark Ages. By the time this story ends, that phrase, Dark Ages, will feel like it belongs to someone else entirely. But before the Tang built any of this, China had to survive something first. 3 centuries of war so consuming, so relentless, that the very idea of a unified empire felt like a memory from another world. That wound is where we begin. Before Chang'an, there was fire, not metaphorical fire, actual armies, actual famines, actual cities reduced to ash while the people who built them starved in the fields outside. When the Han Dynasty, China's first great empire, the civilization that had given the country 4 centuries of relative order, finally collapsed in 220 AD, it did not go quietly. It fragmented into 3 kingdoms, then more, then chaos so complete that historians still struggle to count the dead. And the census numbers alone tell a story that resists easy comprehension. At its height, the Han Empire held roughly 56 million people. Within a few decades of its collapse, war, plague, famine cycling through the population like a scythe, that number had fallen to 16 million. 40 million people. Gone. Not as a metaphor for social disruption. Gone. China would spend the next 3.5 centuries trying to put itself back together. What followed was not one dark age, but several, layered on top of each other. The 3 Kingdoms period. The Jin Dynasty, which reunified China briefly and then shattered against nomadic invasions from the north. The Northern and Southern Dynasties. 16 successive states rising and collapsing across the northern plains, while the south preserved a fragile, yet anxious version of Han culture behind the natural barrier of the Yangtze River. Kingdoms that lasted a generation. Emperors who died young and badly. A country that had once known what it meant to be one thing, slowly forgetting. And then, in 581 AD, a man named Yang Jian walked into the chaos. He was a military general, well-connected, cold-eyed, patient in the way that only a man who has spent his entire career watching others miscalculate can be patient. When the emperor of the Northern Zhou dynasty died and left a power vacuum large enough to swallow an army, Yang Jian moved. He declared himself regent for the dead emperor's child successor. Then, within months, he had the child set aside. He purged 59 members of the Zhou royal family, methodically, and without apparent hesitation, and proclaimed himself Emperor Wen of a new dynasty. He called it the Sui. In 3 months, he unified northern China. By 589 AD, his armies had swept south across the Yangtze and absorbed the last of the southern kingdoms. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, China was one country again. It would not last. The Sui dynasty burned almost as fast as it rose, undone by a second emperor whose ambitions outran his judgment, whose construction projects consumed millions of laborers, whose 3 failed military campaigns against Korea broke the dynasty's finances and its people's patience simultaneously. By 618 AD, the Sui was gone, consumed by the same rebellions that had consumed every dynasty before it. But it had done the one thing that mattered. It had stitched the wound shut, built the Grand Canal connecting north to south, standardized the currency, the law code, the weights and measures, laid the institutional bones on which everything that followed would be built. When a general named Li Wen rode into Chang'an in 618 AD and proclaimed himself the first emperor of the Tang Dynasty, he inherited not rubble, but a skeleton. Imperfect, scarred, still raw in places, but standing. And what the Tang would build on those bones, that is where this story truly begins. Let's talk about what the Tang Dynasty actually built. Not in the abstract, not as a list of policies and emperor names, but as a living world. Because what happened in China between the 7th and 10th centuries was not a chapter in a textbook. It was a civilization operating at a level of sophistication, beauty, and sheer human invention that the rest of the world would not approach for centuries. And the best place to begin understanding it is the same place every merchant, monk, diplomat, and poet of the era eventually arrived: Chang'an. The city had been designed from scratch, laid out on a flat plain in the Wei River Valley by the Sui emperors before the Tang even existed, rebuilt and expanded by the Tang until it covered nearly 80 square kilometers, an area larger than any city in the medieval world, including anything in Europe, the Islamic world, or India. The outer walls ran 6 miles east to west and 5 miles north to south. Inside those walls, 11 streets ran north to south and 14 ran east to west, creating a perfect grid that divided the city into 108 walled residential wards. In each ward was a self-contained neighborhood, sealed each night by its own gates that closed at the sound of drums. The drums are worth pausing on. Every evening, as the sun began to drop, a complex system of drum towers across the city began to beat, a signal that rippled ward by ward, gate by gate, until the whole city was sealed from within. No movement between wards after dark. Soldiers on horseback patrolled the main boulevards. The night in Chang'an was extraordinarily quiet, given the city's size. This controlled, organized silence settling over 1 million people like a lid lowering onto a pot. Then dawn came, the drums beat again, the gates swung open, and the city exploded back into life. Walk the main boulevard at mid-morning, and the scale of the place becomes physical. 150 meters of width, wider than most modern motorways, lined with imperial elm trees planted by government decree, stretching from the southern gates all the way north to the palace complex at the city's heart. The palace itself was enormous by any standard the ancient world could produce. The Daming Palace, completed under Emperor Gaozong and used by Tang emperors for over 2 centuries, occupied its own walled compound at the city's northern edge, its audience halls rising above the rooflines of everything around it, visible from miles away. Inside, throne rooms, ceremonial courtyards, private gardens, pavilions for music and poetry, stables for the emperor's horses, kitchens staffed by hundreds. The palace was not just a residence, it was a statement. This is what power looks like when it stops being afraid. But the heart of the city was not the palace. It was the markets. Chang'an had 2 of them, each covering roughly a square kilometer. The eastern market served the city's domestic needs: salt, tea, silk, grain, timber, horses, precious metals, medicine. The western market was something else entirely. 40,000 shops, 200 distinct categories of trade, a canal running through the center of its 2 wards, carrying goods by barge directly into the market's arteries. The western market was where the world came to sell. Persian merchants with glass vessels so fine they seemed to dissolve in the light. Sogdians from Samarkand, the great Central Asian trading people who had been threading the steppe routes for 1,000 years, with their camel trains loaded with lapis lazuli, carpets from the Red Sea coast, and indigo and pistachios from their home cities. Merchants from India with spices whose names most Chang'an residents could not pronounce. traders from the Korean peninsula with ginseng and pine nuts, Arabians with incense and amber. Byzantine glassware alongside Chinese silk in the same stall, their prices negotiated in a mix of languages that had no single name because no single language covered all of them. The markets opened only at noon, a government regulation enforced by officials who inspected weights and measures and could confiscate counterfeit goods on the spot. They closed at dusk. What happened in the evening, as the Western market laws gradually relaxed across the dynasty's middle years, was that the city invented the night market. Stuffed pancakes from street stalls, exotic pastries from Central Asian bakeries, and in tea houses where you could sit until the war drums sounded and people pressed around you reading poetry aloud. Persian wine houses, real ones, staffed by Central Asian women who served grape wine in agate and amber cups, a detail so specific it survived in Tang literature and tomb paintings both. The night markets that still define street food culture across East Asia today, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, the nighttime economies of a dozen modern cities, trace their origins directly to what Chang'an invented in the 7th and 8th centuries. When people in those cities say they are going out to buy dongxi, east-west, they are using a phrase born in Chang'an's two markets, preserved in the language for 1,300 years. Living inside the city's 108 wards was a population that defied easy categorization. The Tang Empire at its height held roughly 80 million people. Of China's total foreign population at the time, estimated at around 1 million, half of them lived in or around Chang'an. 5% of the capital's population was non-Chinese, not visiting, living, running businesses, serving in the imperial military, holding government posts, practicing their own religions in their own temples with official imperial sanction. Inside the city walls, 111 Buddhist monasteries, 41 Taoist abbeys, 38 family shrines, and crucially, 7 churches of foreign religions, Zoroastrian fire temples where Persian merchants maintained the sacred flame, a Nestorian Christian church established in 631 AD by a Syrian named Alepen, who had walked from the Middle East and been received by Emperor Taizong with enough seriousness that the emperor authorized the building of a monastery. A stele erected in 781 AD recorded the history of this church in both Chinese and Syriac, a bilingual monument in the middle of the Chinese capital to a religion born in the Middle East, sitting unremarkably among the Buddhist and Taoist institutions around it. Manichaean temples, a Jewish trading community in the Western market. A mosque, the Great Mosque of Xi'an, was built in 742 AD and still stands today. None of this was remarkable to the people who lived there. That is the point. These institutions existed in Chang'an for the same reason foreign musicians performed at the imperial court, and foreign styles dominated upper-class fashion. The Tang had decided, collectively and at every level of society, that the world outside China was interesting rather than threatening. They were curious about it. They wanted what it knew and what it could make and how it thought. And they had the confidence to absorb all of it without feeling that their own identity was somehow at risk. Polo arrived from Persia and within 2 generations was the most popular sport of the Tang elite, played on horseback at lethal speed, generating a following so intense that one governor's polo-playing prowess earned him a promotion and cost him an eye. A safer version played on donkeys developed for elite women and older court members. So archaeologists in 2020 found the buried remains of 3 small donkeys in a noblewoman's tomb, arranged to allow her to keep playing in the afterlife. The Sogdian World Dance, a spinning Central Asian performance style, became the entertainment sensation of Tang society, inspiring poetry, ceramics, and court performances for decades. Tang fashion, at its height, was Central Asian fashion, fitted tunics, leopard skin hats, the aesthetic sensibility of the steppe reimagined in the workshops of the world's most sophisticated city. Emperor Taizong himself wore Turkish clothes by preference. He kept a Turkish-style tent on the palace grounds and used it. He spoke Turkish in private conversations. The ruler of the most powerful empire on earth in a nomad's tent. By choice. The culture the Tang produced from this environment was extraordinary, even by the standards of what the dynasty had already achieved. Poetry. The Tang produced more great poetry than any civilization in the history of the world up to that point. Over 48,900 surviving poems from more than 2,200 authors. And historians believe this represents only a fraction of what was actually written, much of it lost when Chang'an burned in the rebellions of the dynasty's later years. Poetry was not a pastime in the Tang. It was a civic function. Passing the imperial examinations, the pathway to government service, required demonstrating mastery of verse composition. Officials competed in poetry contests at banquets. Emperors wrote poems and expected their ministers to respond in kind. The poet Li Bai, who drank wine with the ferocity of a man for whom sobriety was a kind of death, wrote verse so fluid and strange it seemed to have been composed somewhere between waking and dreaming. And it was circulated in his lifetime across the empire, copied by hand, memorized by people who had never met him. Du Fu, who had watched the dynasty fracture around him and write about it in real time, was already developing the moral intensity that would make him the greatest of them all. Painting flourished. Sculpture, woodblock printing, the technique of carving a page of text or images into a wooden block and pressing it against paper to produce copies, was being developed in Tang workshops, a technology whose implications for the transmission of knowledge were enormous and still incompletely understood by the court that first used it. The music poured in from everywhere. Instruments from Kucha in the Tarim Basin, oboes, lacquered drums, cymbals from India. The pipa, a four-stringed lute of Central Asian origin, became the defining sound of Tang court music. The emperor maintained the Pear Garden, an imperial academy of music and dance, the first institution in Chinese history dedicated solely to the performing arts, whose graduates set the standard for performance across the empire. The phrase, disciples of the Pear Garden, is still used in Chinese today to describe performing artists. Architecture grew in ambition throughout the dynasty. Buddhist cave temples at Dunhuang and Longmen filled with murals of such scale and technical mastery that they remain, today, among the greatest artistic achievements of any civilization. The Big Goose Pagoda, built in Chang'an in 652 to house the Buddhist manuscripts that monk Xuanzang brought back from India, still stands in what is now Xi'an, one of the oldest structures surviving from the Tang, its stone weathered but intact, rising above a city that has forgotten almost everything else the Tang built. Japan and Korea watched all of this and copied it, deliberately, systematically, admiringly. The Japanese capital of Heian-kyo, what is now Kyoto, was laid out on the Chang'an grid pattern, scaled down but structurally identical, a city built in explicit imitation of the greatest city its architects had ever seen. The Korean Silla Kingdom modeled their capital Gyeongju the same way. Japanese students came to Chang'an to study law, medicine, governance, and philosophy, returned home, and helped build what became Japanese civilization. Made the Chinese characters that form the basis of written Japanese were adapted from Tangera Chinese. The governmental institutions, the legal codes, the examination system, all of it transmitted outward from Chang'an like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, reaching the edges of the known world and reshaping what they found there. This is what the Tang was at its height. Not a dynasty in the textbook sense. A sequence of emperors and dates and battles. A world, a functioning, breathing, inventing, arguing, singing, trading, building world that happened to be centered on a single city in the Shanxi plain, and that produced, across 3 centuries, a quantity and quality of human achievement that any civilization in history would be proud to claim. It could not last forever. No world that size, that open, with that many moving parts, ever does. In 755 AD, a general named An Lushan, of mixed Sogdian and Turkish descent, a product of the very openness the Tang had cultivated, marched on Chang'an with 100,000 frontier veterans. The capital fell. The emperor fled into Sichuan. The pear garden was abandoned. The poets scattered. The rebellion took 8 years to suppress, and when it was over, something essential had changed. Not broken entirely, but cracked in a way that never fully healed. The Tang spent its final century and a half diminishing, the confidence that had made Chang'an the center of the world slowly closing in on itself. By 907 AD, it was gone. Dissolved into the 5 dynasties period, 50 years of fragmentation that looked, from inside it, like the end of everything the Tang had built. It wasn't. What the Tang had created, the institutions, the trade networks, the accumulated knowledge, the habits of governance, survived the dynasty that built them. And in 960 AD, when a general named Zhao Kuang-yin reunified most of China and founded the Song Dynasty, he inherited all of it. He would do something the Tang had never managed with what he inherited. The Tang built its world from confidence. The Song, smaller and militarily weaker and perpetually under threat, would build something from necessity. And necessity, as it turns out, produces a different and stranger kind of genius. All of that. The polo fields and the Persian wine houses, the drums closing the ward gates at night, the 40,000 shops of the Western market, the poets competing at imperial banquets, and the Japanese students copying Chang'an's street grid to take home and rebuild in Kyoto. All of that was the surface of the Tang world. Brilliant, yes. Unprecedented, yes. But surface. Beneath it, in quieter rooms, something else was happening. In the monasteries, monks were pressing ink onto carved wooden blocks and watching identical copies of sacred texts appear, one after another, at a speed no human hand could match. In the workshops near the Taoist temples, alchemists were heating minerals together in crucibles, searching for a compound that would make a man immortal. In the counting houses of Sichuan, merchants were handing each other slips of bamboo bark paper and agreeing, through a kind of collective faith, that the paper was worth something. And in the study of a retired Song Dynasty official named Shen Kuo, a magnetized needle was floating in a bowl of water, pointing south. These were the inventions. Not the inventions of a dynasty or a court or a policy. The inventions of individual people working on specific problems in specific rooms, mostly failing at what they were actually trying to do. And what they stumbled into changed the world more lastingly than any emperor or army or trade route ever did. There is a Taoist text from the 9th century that contains a warning. It reads, roughly, as follows: "Do not heat together sulfur, realgar, and saltpeter with honey. Those who have done so have had the mixture catch fire, singe their beards, and burn down the building in which they were working." This is not a weapons manual. It is not a military document, and it is an alchemical handbook, a guide for men who spent their lives trying to brew the elixir of immortality. The warning exists because someone, somewhere in Tang Dynasty China, had already made the mistake. Probably more than once. The burning buildings, the singed beards. These are the traces of repeated experiments, each one a failed attempt to transcend death, each one accidentally producing something else entirely. The Chinese called what they had found Huo Yao, fire medicine. We call it gunpowder. To understand what was happening in those workshops, you have to understand what Taoism actually was in the Tang Dynasty. Not as philosophy, but as a living practice. Taoist alchemists were not fringe figures. They were serious men engaged in what they understood to be serious science, backed by imperial patronage, operating at the intersection of medicine, chemistry, and spiritual inquiry in a way that made no distinction between the three. Their central obsession was the Dan, the elixir. The character for it depicts a crucible with a piece of cinnabar inside, the red mercury sulfide mineral that Taoist alchemists believed held transformative properties. Heat the right combination of minerals, refine them correctly, find the formula that converts mortal tissue into something that does not age, does not decay, does not die. Emperor after emperor funded this research. Some of them consumed its results. At least 5 Tang emperors died of heavy metal poisoning from the elixir compounds they drank: gold, mercury, arsenic, lead, all in service of the dream of living forever. Emperor Shenzong, who reigned in the early 9th century, employed a court alchemist named Liu Mi, gave him a governorship so he'd have access to the mountain herbs he claimed he needed, and consumed his compounds until his behavior became so erratic that palace eunuchs eventually strangled him. His son had Liu Mi beaten to death within a month of taking the throne. These men were not stupid. They were operating at the edge of what human knowledge could achieve at the time, and in the process of all that failing, all those heated crucibles, all those refined minerals, all those compounds that produced the wrong result, they stumbled into a discovery that would kill more people over the next millennium than almost anything else in human history. Sulfur, saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which the Chinese extracted from the crystalline deposits that formed on dunghills and cave walls. Charcoal, mixed in certain proportions and exposed to heat or flame, a rapid, violent, expanding reaction. Not an elixir, not immortality, something that ignited. At first they used it for fireworks, the controlled, beautiful version of the explosion, the one that lit up festival nights in Chang'an and left the sky smelling of smoke and sulfur. Then, for signal flares. Then, by the late Tang and into the Song Dynasty, for fire arrows. Fire lances, tubes of bamboo or iron packed with the mixture used to shoot flames at enemies. Bombs, eventually guns. The weaponization of the discovery was gradual, almost reluctant, as if the technology kept insisting on applications that its inventors hadn't intended. By the time the Song Dynasty was defending its borders against the Yurchen Jin in the 12th century, Chinese armies were using grenades, oi bombs, and rockets in battle. The Mongols, when they eventually conquered the Song, learned the technology from the people they defeated and spread it west across Central Asia and into the Middle East and Europe. Roger Bacon described gunpowder in Europe in 1267. He appears to have understood that it came from somewhere east. He was right. There is a direct line from the Taoist alchemist with singed beards in a 9th century workshop to every gun fired in every war the modern world has produced. He was trying to live forever. What he found instead has been killing people ever since. The irony has never been resolved. While the alchemists were burning down their buildings in search of immortality, something quieter was happening in the workshops of Chang'an. When someone had noticed that if you carved the text of a document into a block of wood, backwards, in mirror image, in relief, and coated the raised surface with ink and pressed paper against it, you could produce an exact copy of that document. Then another copy. Then another. The block did not wear out quickly. You could press hundreds of copies from a single carving. The technique was called woodblock printing, and the people who developed it in the Tang Dynasty were, almost certainly, Buddhist monks. Not because monks were uniquely clever, though the Buddhist monasteries of the Tang were among the most intellectually active institutions in the country, but because they had a specific, urgent need. The Buddha's teachings held that copying a sacred text was itself an act of devotion, an accumulation of spiritual merit. Now, the more copies of a sutra existed in the world, the more merit accrued. An empress in Japan, having learned of the technique through the Buddhist networks that connected China and Japan, ordered 1 million copies of a short prayer text produced in a single decade in the late 8th century, a number that would have been impossible to achieve by hand. The earliest surviving printed texts in the world are Buddhist documents. The technology was born in service of faith, but it did not stay there long. By 762 AD, the first commercially printed books were being sold in the markets of Chang'an. By 782, printed receipts were circulating in the marketplace as documents for business transactions and tax payments. The technology had moved from monastery to market in less than 2 generations. And then came the Diamond Sutra. In 868 AD, there's a man named Wang Jai commissioned the printing of a complete Buddhist text, the Diamond Sutra, a canonical scripture, and had it done not in a monastery workshop, but in a commercial print house. The colophon at the end of the scroll, still surviving, reads, "Reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Jie on behalf of his 2 parents." It is the world's oldest complete printed book with a confirmed date. You can see it today in the British Library in London, where it arrived after being removed from the Mogao caves of Dunhuang in 1907. It was printed 4 centuries before Gutenberg's Bible. The woodblock technique had limitations that became apparent with scale. To print the complete Buddhist canon, the Tripitaka, and the collected scriptural foundation of Chinese Buddhism, a monk named Zhang Tuxin began the project in 971 AD at the start of the Song Dynasty. He finished it 12 years later, 1,076 volumes, each one carved block by block. The labor involved was extraordinary, and because the carved block could only reproduce one specific page of one specific text, you could not reuse it for anything else. Someone looked at this problem and asked the obvious question: what if, instead of carving an entire page at once, you carved each character separately and rearranged them for each new page? The man who answered that question was named Bi Sheng. We know almost nothing about him. Shen Kuo, the great Song Dynasty scholar who documented everything, described him in his Dream Pool essays as a man of unofficial position, a commoner, not a monk, and not a court official. He was working sometime between 1041 and 1048 AD during the reign of Emperor Renzong. His method, as Shen Kuo recorded it, with the precision of someone who clearly found it fascinating. He took sticky clay and cut individual characters into it, as thin as the edge of a coin. He baked them in fire until they hardened. He prepared an iron plate covered in a mixture of pine resin, wax, and paper ash. He set an iron frame on the plate and packed his clay type inside it, pressing the characters together. He held the plate near heat until the wax mixture softened, then pressed a flat board over the surface to even it. The result was a page of type as smooth as a whetstone, ready to print. When printing was finished, he held the plate near the fire again, loosened the wax, and the characters fell free. He sorted them back into their cases, each character labeled and stored by rhyme group, ready for the next document. For common characters, the ones that appeared most often on any given page, he kept 20 or more copies. Because a character you had used earlier in the page might need to be used again before the printing was done. Movable type. 4 centuries before Gutenberg, who is celebrated in the Western world as its inventor, a commoner in Song Dynasty China, had solved the same problem using clay and an iron plate. The reason it did not transform China the way the printing press transformed Europe comes down to a single architectural difference between Chinese and alphabetic writing. Latin requires 26 characters to render any word in the language, and Chinese requires thousands. Some estimates put the total number of characters a well-educated person would need to read and write at 50,000 or more. Setting a page of Latin type from a font of 26 letters is fast. Setting a page of Chinese type from a warehouse of thousands of individual characters is slower, and the advantage of movable type over woodblock printing for any given print run is correspondingly smaller. Gutenberg's press was revolutionary, partly because the Latin alphabet made it so. Baisheng's press was revolutionary in principle, but the Chinese writing system blunted its practical edge. Woodblock printing, carving one entire page at a time, remained dominant in China for centuries. But the idea was there. The logic was correct. And when the technology eventually reached Europe, out through pathways historians still argue about, whether through the Mongol networks, through Arab merchants, through some more indirect chain, it met an alphabetic writing system and exploded into the information revolution that remade the Western world. Baisheng, commoner, 1041 A.D. Gutenberg, goldsmith, 1440 A.D. The gap is 400 years. By the time Baisheng was pressing his clay characters into an iron frame, Song Dynasty scholars were also turning their attention to a problem that had puzzled natural philosophers for centuries. A piece of lodestone, magnetite, naturally magnetized iron ore, always oriented itself the same way when hung freely on a thread or floated on water. It pointed south. The Chinese had known this for more than 1,000 years. Feng Shui practitioners used lodestone spoons to align buildings and burial sites with the cardinal directions, the spoon's handle swinging always to point at the south. The device was called the Sinan, the south-pointing governor. But lodestone was heavy, fragile, and finicky. You needed a perfectly smooth surface for the spoon to rotate without friction. In rough weather, on a ship at sea, it was nearly useless. In 1088 A.D., Shen Kuo, the same polymath who recorded Baisheng's movable type, sat down in his garden study and wrote the following in his Dream Pool essays. Geomancers magnetize a needle by rubbing its tip with a piece of lodestone and then hang the needle on a single thread of silk. The needle, he observed, does not point precisely south. It points slightly east of south. This deviation, which he was the first person in the world to record, is now called magnetic declination. Shen Kuo described 4 ways to mount the magnetized needle: on a thread of silk, balanced on a fingertip, floating in a bowl of water, or placed on the edge of a bowl's rim. The floating needle in water, he observed, was the most stable. The water dampened the needle's oscillation and kept it pointing consistently. The improvement over lodestone was significant. An iron needle, thin and light, magnetized by rubbing against lodestone, floating in water on a small piece of wood or cork. This could be carried. This could work on a ship. This could function in darkness, in clouds, in the middle of the ocean, where there were no stars and no landmarks, and nothing to orient yourself by except the invisible magnetic field of the earth beneath you. Within a generation of Shen Kuo's description, Chinese mariners were using the floating needle compass for navigation. The first written confirmation of this comes from around 1117 A.D., a text called the Pingzhou Table Talks, which mentions that navigators aboard ships used a compass needle when clouds obscured the stars. Before the compass, ocean navigation was a matter of hugging coastlines, reading stars on clear nights, trusting the knowledge of pilots who had made a route before. After the compass, the deep ocean became, if not safe, then at least navigable in the dark. The whole maritime world opened differently. Arab merchants trading with Song Dynasty China encountered the compass and brought the technology westward. And by 1190 A.D., it appears in European literature, described by an English theologian as a device already known to sailors. European navigators adopted it with enthusiasm. The same compass that Shen Kuo described in his garden in 1088 was, in modified form, aboard the ships of Columbus in 1492 and Vasco da Gama in 1498. The age of discovery, the European expansion across the oceans that reshaped the world, was navigated using a technology invented in Song Dynasty China. There is no route to the Americas that doesn't pass through a bowl of water in Shen Kuo's garden. Of the four great inventions that China gave the world, gunpowder, printing, the compass, and paper, the last one is often the most surprising to people who encounter it for the first time, not paper itself. Paper was invented in the Han Dynasty, centuries before the Tang. What the Song Dynasty invented was something more audacious, the idea that a piece of paper could, by agreement, be worth something. In the Sichuan region of western China, around the turn of the 11th century, merchants faced a problem. Sichuan used iron coins. Iron coins were legal, accepted everywhere, worth what they said they were worth, and crushingly heavy. A string of 1,000 iron coins, the unit of account for most significant transactions, weighed several kilograms. A merchant conducting large-scale commerce across distance was effectively a pack animal as well as a businessman hauling the weight of his own money. Around 1008 AD, 16 merchants in the Sichuan capital of Chengdu found a solution. They began issuing receipts, printed on paper made of bamboo bark, stamped with seals and markings, denominated according to the coins the holder had deposited. You gave the merchant house your iron coins. They gave you a piece of paper saying you had that many coins. You could use the paper to pay someone else. That person could redeem it at the house for the coins or simply pass the paper along again. The paper was called jiaozi, a promissory note, a deposit certificate, not yet quite money, but performing money's function, representing value, circulating in place of the heavy thing it stood for. The system worked. It worked well enough that other merchant houses started issuing their own notes. It worked so well that it started to go wrong in the predictable way. Some houses issued more notes than they had coins to back them. They couldn't redeem everything when it was presented. They failed. Merchants who had trusted them lost everything. In 1023 AD, the Song government stepped in. They nationalized the system, established the first government office in the world specifically dedicated to issuing paper currency, standardized the notes, the denominations, the security features, printed them in controlled quantities, at least initially, backed by reserves of coin and silver. It was the world's first government-issued paper money. Sweden would not issue paper currency until 1661. The Bank of England, now regarded as one of the oldest and most influential financial institutions in the Western world, was founded in 1694. The Song Dynasty had been operating a government paper currency system for more than 6 centuries before either of those events. And then, in the way that governments have always done with the ability to print money, the Song started printing too much. Military pressures in the 12th century, the Jurchen Jin had conquered northern China, and the southern Song was perpetually scrambling to fund its defenses, led to massive overissuance. Notes were printed without sufficient coin to back them. The purchasing power of the jiaozi collapsed. Inflation became severe. By the 13th century, facing the Mongol threat, the situation grew desperate. The government printed notes with no reserve at all, pure fiat money backed by nothing but the state's authority to demand acceptance. The value evaporated. People stopped trusting the paper. The system had to be rebuilt from scratch under each successive dynasty, and each one repeated roughly the same sequence. Issue carefully, manage reasonably, then, facing some crisis, some expense too large to cover through taxation alone, print more than the system could bear, destroy confidence, collapse. The modern world, with its central banks and quantitative easing and inflation debates and reserve requirements, is still running variations of the same experiment the Song Dynasty ran in 1023 AD. They were the first people to discover that a government could issue money it didn't have. They were also the first people to discover what happens when a government does that without limit. Everything we know about paper money, the promise of it, the danger of it, the way it works when it works and fails when it fails, was first learned in Sichuan 1,000 years ago by a government that needed to pay its soldiers and didn't have enough iron coins. 4 inventions. Gunpowder from the search for eternal life. Printing from the need to multiply sacred texts. The compass from a floating needle in a bowl of water. Paper money from merchants who were tired of carrying iron. None of them were invented for the purpose they served. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this period. The Tang and Song did not set out to arm the world's armies, democratize knowledge, open the oceans, or create the financial system. They set out to live forever, to copy scripture, to find south in the dark, to move money without moving coins. The world historical consequences were accidental, byproducts of a civilization that was thinking about something else, which raises a question worth sitting with. What were they thinking about next? Because while all of this was happening, while the gunpowder was exploding and the presses were printing and the needles were floating south, the Song Dynasty was doing something with its economy that no one in the world had done before. And it is perhaps the strangest story of all. There is a painting made sometime in the early 12th century that is roughly the length of a living room wall. It is a hand scroll, ink and color on silk, meant to be held and unrolled gradually, one arm's length at a time, the viewer moving through it at their own pace, the way a person moves through a city. And what it shows, across its 5 meters of silk, is a city. A single day in a single city, every level of society present simultaneously. Farmers in the fields outside the walls, merchants unloading boats at the river's edge, Miss officials on horseback, children flying kites, street vendors, restaurants, inns, a tax office, a crowded bridge across the central canal. Over 800 individual figures, each one doing something specific, each one a face rather than a symbol. The painting is called Along the River during the Qingming festival. The city it shows is Kaifeng, capital of the Northern Song Dynasty. The artist was a man named Wu Zetian, and almost nothing is known about him except his work. His name appears in a single inscription added decades after the painting was made. The painting is sometimes called China's Mona Lisa, but that comparison sells it short. The Mona Lisa is a face. This is a world. To understand what the Song Dynasty actually was, it helps to stand for a moment with that painting and let it tell you. The Kaifeng it shows was not a city organized along the rigid walled ward lines of Chang'an. The old system, where each residential district was sealed at night, markets only open at noon, movement controlled and documented, had been quietly dissolved. The Song had done something the Tang never managed. It had let the city be itself. Markets operated day and night. Shops and residences mixed freely on the same streets. Private businesses sprawled wherever there was demand. The famous bridge in Wu Zetian's painting, the Rainbow Bridge, arching over the canal at the scroll's center, is lined on both sides with stalls, vendors, crowds, a boat approaching at a dangerous angle with its mast not yet lowered, people on the bridge shouting and gesturing to warn the crew. This was not a ceremonial capital, arranged for the display of imperial power. It was a commercial city, arranged for the movement of goods and money, and the difference between the two tells you almost everything about how the Song understood the world. By the 12th century, Kaifeng held over 1 million people. London at the same moment held around 15,000, and Kaifeng was not alone. The Song had 52 large urban prefectures, each containing more than 100,000 households, dozens of cities, a genuinely urban civilization, at a time when most of the world was still debating whether cities larger than a market town were possible. What drove all of this was not just the city, it was what had happened to the countryside. The Song inherited a problem from the Tang's collapse. The north had been devastated, populations displaced, its agricultural systems disrupted. The solution, over the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, was a systematic expansion of rice cultivation in the south, accelerated by the introduction of a new strain of rice from Champa, in what is now Vietnam. Champa rice matured faster than existing Chinese varieties. It could be grown twice in a single year where before only one harvest was possible. It was drought-resistant. It was less demanding on the soil. The effect was not subtle. Agricultural output rose roughly 50% above Tang Dynasty levels. Between the 10th and 11th centuries alone, China's population doubled, from around 50 million to over 100 million people. That surplus food and surplus labor had to go somewhere. It went into the cities, into the workshops, and into the iron furnaces and the shipyards and the silk looms and the printing houses. The iron industry alone is staggering to contemplate. By 1078 AD, China was producing somewhere between 75,000 and 150,000 tons of iron per year. England, at the start of its industrial revolution in the 18th century, generally considered the opening of the modern industrial age, was producing roughly the same amount. The Song was doing it 600 years earlier, powered by coal that Chinese engineers had learned to use as an industrial fuel when the forests around the iron-producing regions of the north began to run out. Blast furnaces, hydraulic bellows worked by water mills, iron cheap enough that ordinary farmers could afford iron tools, iron pots, iron nails. A material that had once been precious enough to be hoarded, becoming so abundant it reshaped daily life at every level of society. This is what historians mean when they talk about a Song dynasty economic revolution, not a metaphor. An actual revolution in production, labor, trade, and urban organization, happening in the 11th and 12th centuries in a country that the Western world has historically filed under medieval. And the economy that emerged from all of this was structurally unlike anything that had existed before it. The Tang had run a command economy, key industries under government monopoly, resources allocated from the top, merchants treated with Confucian suspicion as people who produced nothing and merely moved things that others had made. The Song moved away from this almost from the beginning. Not entirely. Gunpowder and tea remained state monopolies for revenue reasons, but broadly, across most of the economy, the Song allowed markets to operate as markets. Private enterprise, competition, profit. Merchants who were genuinely wealthy. A middle class, not just aristocrats and peasants, but a range of people in between. Shopkeepers, artisans, minor traders, minor officials, men who had passed some examinations but not enough to enter the senior bureaucracy, and who now found in commerce a path to prosperity that earlier Chinese dynasties had actively suppressed. Guilds organizing trade and setting prices, banks extending credit, investors putting money into multiple ships simultaneously to spread the risk of any one vessel being lost. An early form of portfolio diversification, recognized by historians of economics as a proto-modern financial technique. Song China's national income has been estimated at roughly 3 times that of 12th century Europe. Not a third more, 3 times. The gap between this economy and the economy surrounding it was so large that it strains the conventional vocabulary of medieval history to describe. One factory in Hangzhou in 1175 employed more than 1,000 workers per day to print paper money. A single factory. More than 1,000 workers. The sheer scale of the Song's monetary infrastructure, its production capacity, its urban population, its agricultural output, these are numbers that fit naturally into discussions of the early modern world, not the medieval one, which is precisely the point. Walking through Kaifeng at this period, through the pleasure districts Zhang Zeduan's painting hints at in its bustling side streets, you would have encountered things that no European traveler of the time would have had a framework to comprehend. Theaters that could seat several thousand people, 50 of them clustered in the pleasure district alone. Restaurants specializing in regional cuisines from across the empire, some of them operating through the night in defiance of curfews that no one any longer enforced. Street food vendors, bookshops, an industry that had barely existed before woodblock printing made books cheap enough for ordinary people to own. Specialized merchants, those who sold only birds, others only gold and silver, others only musical instruments or medical herbs or paintings or dyed fabrics. A description written by a man named Meng Yuanlao, who lived in Kaifeng before it fell to the Jurchen Jin in 1127 and wrote from nostalgia in the years after, lists the alleys near the Xiangou Temple in such specific detail that historians can reconstruct entire neighborhoods. The shops selling cloth caps and belts and books, the vegetarian restaurants of the Ding family, the merchants in Embroidery Alley, the southern restaurants inside the smaller alleys, the brothels of Manager's Alley nearby. He writes about it the way people write about places they love and have lost. You can feel the grief between the lines. The city he was describing had been the largest, most commercially sophisticated urban center on Earth. And in 1127, the Jurchen Jin army marched south and took it. The fall of Kaifeng was not the end of the song. When it was the end of the northern song, the surviving court retreated south, crossed the Yangtze, established a new capital at Hangzhou, and created what historians call the Southern Song, a rump state, militarily weaker than its predecessor, perpetually paying tribute to the Jin in the north to maintain an uneasy peace. Smaller, diminished. Having lost the traditional heartland of Chinese civilization, the Yellow River Valley that every previous dynasty had considered the center of the world, and yet, impossibly, infuriatingly, in a way that makes the song impossible to summarize neatly. The Southern Song was in some respects more economically sophisticated than the Northern Song had been. Pushed south, the dynasty developed maritime trade with a ferocity that the North had never needed. The Chinese merchant ships in this period were the largest and most technologically advanced in the world. Junks capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo, guided by the compass Shen Kuo had described in his garden, equipped with watertight bulkheads that would not appear in European ship design until the 18th century. They traded with the Indian subcontinent, with the Persian Gulf, with East Africa. The Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, writing in 1154, described the prowess of Chinese merchant ships in the Indian Ocean and the annual voyages that brought silk, iron, and porcelain to places as far as Aden and the Euphrates. By the 12th century, commercial taxes on trade, had overtaken agricultural taxes as the primary source of government revenue for the first time in Chinese history. A dynasty that had always understood itself as fundamentally agrarian had, under military pressure and geographic displacement, become fundamentally commercial, transformed by defeat into something more modern than it had been before. But the song's brilliance was not only economic, it was also a civilization at its most intellectually alive. The moment when the questions the Tang had raised about governance, about talent, about how a state should select and use its best minds came to a head. In 1069, Emperor Shenzong appointed a man named Wang Anshi as his chief minister. Wang Anshi was a reformer in the truest sense, not a man who wanted to modify the existing system incrementally, but a man who had spent 20 years in local government watching the same problems reproduce themselves across every prefecture he administered, and had concluded that the root causes had to be addressed directly. He wrote a letter to the emperor, 10,000 characters long, diagnosing the empire's fiscal crisis, its military vulnerability, its inequitable taxation, its dependence on private moneylenders who charged small farmers interest rates of up to 100% a year. His proposed solution was a program so comprehensive, so structurally modern in its logic, that historians studying it in the 20th and 21st centuries have reached for the vocabulary of Keynesian economics to describe it. State loans to farmers at 20% annual interest, crushing by modern standards, but genuinely low compared to the private moneylenders who had previously been their only option. The Green Sprouts Law, it was called. Government credit extended in spring, when seeds needed buying and the granaries were empty, repaid after harvest. A land survey to find the vast tracts of farmland that wealthy landowners had hidden from the tax registers. An end to the corvée, the unpaid labor that peasants owed the state, replaced by a cash payment that everyone, including the previously exempt wealthy, had to contribute. Market exchange bureau in every major city to buy up surplus goods from regions of abundance and sell them in regions of shortage, stabilizing prices and undercutting the merchant guilds that had been manipulating both ends of the transaction. The debate that followed Wang Anshi's reforms tore the Song court apart for decades. His opponents, led by the historian-statesman Sima Guang, argued that the reforms were coercive, impractical, and contrary to Confucian principles of governance. That good government should cultivate virtuous officials, not engineer economic systems. The famous poet Su Shi was jailed and exiled for publicly criticizing Wang's program. When Wang fell from favor in 1076, his reforms were repealed. When the next emperor came of age, they were reinstated. The alternation between reform and anti-reform factions became one of the central dynamics of the late Northern Song, a political argument that was still unresolved when the Jin army arrived and resolved it by force. What the argument was actually about, stripped of its Confucian vocabulary, it was a question that the modern world has never stopped asking. How much should the state intervene in the economy? Wang Anshi believed the answer was significantly. Sima Guang believed it was very little. Both of them were operating with intellectual tools, the study of markets, the theory of credit, the mechanics of price stabilization, that European thinkers would not develop for another 5 or 6 centuries. The Song was fighting about canes before Keynes was born. All of this, the rice fields producing double harvests, the iron furnaces running on coal, the ships navigating the Indian Ocean by compass, the merchant guilds and the paper money and the credit markets and the reform debates, happened while the dynasty was militarily weak, geographically diminished, perpetually paying tribute to stronger neighbors just to survive. This is the paradox the Song presents to history. Every other civilization that achieved this level of economic and intellectual sophistication did so from a position of military dominance. The Romans built their commercial empire on conquest. The British built theirs on naval supremacy. The Song built theirs despite losing, despite being smaller than they should have been, despite paying the Jin in silk and silver every year just to be left alone. Necessity, it turns out, is a more reliable engine of innovation than power has ever been. But a civilization this complex, this many moving parts, this much trade, this many ships and furnaces and printing houses and paper money factories, raises a question that the Tang had first asked, and the Song made urgent. Who governs it? Not who holds the throne. That question had always had an answer, usually involving blood and force. The deeper question was, who fills the thousands of administrative positions below the throne? Who collects the taxes and manages the granaries and adjudicates the disputes and writes the policies? Who, in other words, actually runs the machinery of a state this sophisticated? The Tang had proposed an answer so radical that it took centuries for the world to fully understand what had been suggested. Not birth, not family, not recommendation from a patron or a fee paid to a ministry. A test. And the story of that test, what it was, what it achieved, and the paradox buried so deeply inside its genius that it took 1,000 years to fully emerge, is one of the strangest stories this civilization produced. The cell is roughly the size of a wardrobe. Stone on 3 sides, a wooden board running the length of the back wall that functions, depending on where you position it, as either a desk or a bed, a second board below it, a brazier, if it is cold enough that officials permit one, an oil lamp, and you, with your brushes, your inkstone, your bowl of water, and somewhere between 1 and 3 days to produce the document that will determine the entire shape of your remaining life. Outside the cell door, which is sealed, the examination compound stretches in every direction. Hundreds of cells arranged in long corridors like the cells of a hive, each one containing a man in the same position, hunched forward, brush moving or paused, the lamp guttering in the draft from the corridor beyond. The collective quiet of it is enormous. No voices. The scratch of brushes on paper. Occasionally, in the distance, the sound of an official walking the corridors with a lamp, checking that no one is passing notes through the gaps in the partition walls. If a candidate falls ill inside the cell, he is not released. If he dies, his body is wrapped in straw matting and passed over the compound wall so the examination can continue undisturbed. This is the Keiju, the imperial examination, the most radical idea the medieval world produced for how a civilization should be governed, and, buried inside its genius, a paradox so complete that it would take 1,000 years for the full weight of it to become clear. Start with what the Tang Dynasty had inherited. Before the examination system mattered, before it was more than a formality, it was a ceremonial gesture toward the idea of merit. China was governed the way every other major civilization on Earth governed itself, through blood and connection. The 9-rank system that had organized the aristocracy since the 3rd century operated on a simple premise. High-ranking families produced high-ranking sons. Recommendation flowed downward through networks of obligation and patronage. The man who ran your prefecture did so because his father had run the prefecture before him, or because someone powerful enough to install him had judged him useful, which usually meant connected. This produced competent officials sometimes. When it aligned talented people with positions that matched their abilities, the system worked. But talent and birth share no particular relationship. They never have. The child of a great administrator is just as likely to be mediocre as the child of a farmer. And the child of the farmer is just as likely to be brilliant. The 9-rank system had no mechanism for this. It could not find what it was not looking for. The Sui dynasty had proposed the alternative. The Tang dynasty made it real. The examination itself was several examinations nested inside each other, each one a gate that the previous candidates had to pass through before the next gate appeared. At the local level, a candidate, any adult male in China, regardless of family, regardless of wealth, with a small number of explicit exceptions, could present himself for testing. The exceptions matter. Slaves were barred, and so were sons of actors and merchants, which tells you something about the social anxieties running beneath the system's surface. But within those constraints, the range was genuine. A farmer's son, a craftsman's son, a minor local official's son who had not managed to inherit his father's position. Anyone who could read and write and who had spent years absorbing the classical canon to the depth the examination required could sit down in a local examination hall and attempt the first gate. What they were tested on was the Confucian classics, the 4 books, the 5 classics, the Analects, the Mencius, the Book of Documents, the Book of Songs, the Book of Changes. Texts accumulated over centuries into a canon that any aspirant to governance was expected to carry entirely in his memory, because the examination had no open book option. You brought your mind, and the texts were already there or they were not. The pass rate at the local level was low. The number who passed and could proceed to the metropolitan examination in the capital was smaller. And then, for those who survived that, the final gate, the Jinshi examination, the presented scholar degree, the gauntlet that sat at the apex of everything else, and that, by the Tang Dynasty's middle period, had become the only examination that truly determined the shape of a career. The Jinshi pass rate was 1 to 2%, not of all men in China, of the candidates who had already survived the previous filters, 1 to 2% of the men who had already demonstrated enough capacity to reach the final stage. Now, across the whole Tang Dynasty, nearly 3 centuries of regular examination cycles, a total of 6,585 men earned the Jinshi degree, an average of 23 per year, in an empire of 50, then 60, then 80 million people. 23. What the examination actually asked of its candidates at the Jinshi level was not just memory, though memory was required in quantities that are difficult for the modern mind to fully visualize. The Confucian canon ran to roughly 400,000 characters. Internalizing it, not summarizing it, not understanding its themes, but being able to reproduce any passage from any text at the examiner's direction was the baseline, the thing you needed before the harder demands began. Then came composition. Policy essays responding to specific questions about governance, economics, military affairs, hydraulic engineering, disaster relief, the practical machinery of running a state. The candidate was not being asked to demonstrate that he had memorized the right answer. He was being asked to think, to apply the classical principles he had absorbed to problems that were real or posed as real, and to do so in prose that was itself an object of evaluation. After the Tang Restoration added a poetry requirement, sometime between 730 and 740 AD under Emperor Xuanzong, the examination demanded that candidates compose original verse on a set theme in a specific form, demonstrating the kind of technical mastery over language that takes a lifetime to develop. You could not cram your way to a Jinshi degree. You could not buy one. You could only earn it. When the results were posted, the list of names, the Jin Bang, hung on the wall of the examination compound. Men gathered around it the way people gather around the notice board of a verdict. Those whose names appeared were met with celebration that the Tang government institutionalized into ceremony. A banquet hosted by officials, a parade through the capital on horseback, a visit to the Big Goose Pagoda, where successful candidates carved their names in the stone and left their marks beside the names of the men who had passed before them. The population of Chang'an turned out for it. The phrase that circulated through Tang literature to describe the moment of success, stepping through the dragon's door, carried the weight of a transformation. You were one thing before, you were something else after. Those whose names did not appear, and 98 of every 100 names did not appear, went home or stayed and studied or attempted the cycle again in the following year. Some men spent their entire lives attempting the examination. They sat it in their 20s and their 40s and their 60s. The system allowed this. A Song Dynasty account, and famous enough to be incorporated into the 3-character classic that every Chinese schoolchild memorized, describes a man named Liang Hao, who finally passed at the age of 84. It is told as an inspiration. Whether it was also a caution, look how long a brilliant man might spend feeding himself to this machine before it recognizes him, is left to the reader. What the examination system produced in its best form was something no other contemporary civilization had managed to produce, a class of administrators selected primarily for their intellectual capacity rather than their birth. By the late Tang period, the great aristocratic clans that had dominated Chinese politics for centuries had been hollowed out, not by conquest, by competition. Their sons could still sit the examinations, and some of them passed. But they were competing now against everyone else, and everyone else included farmers' sons who had spent a decade doing nothing but reading, writing, and thinking. The old families hired the best tutors. The poor candidates had only their own discipline and whatever local school or provincial academy they could access. Both of them arrived at the same examination cell in front of the same sealed door with the same questions on the table. The data from later dynasties makes the point with uncomfortable clarity. During the Song period, roughly 40 to 50% of Jinshi degree holders came from families with no previous history of official appointment. In the mid-12th century, A survey of degree holders showed that more than half were first-generation officials, men whose fathers and grandfathers had held no government position. The system was doing what it claimed to do, and this was genuinely revolutionary. Britain would not introduce competitive examinations for its civil service until 1855. Examinations that were, incidentally, modeled in part on what the Chinese had been doing for over 1,000 years. The modern meritocracy, the idea that a state's administrative positions should be filled by the people best qualified to fill them as demonstrated by competitive testing, is not a Western invention. It is a Tang Dynasty invention, scaled up by the Song and passed eventually, through admiration, through influence, through the reports of Jesuit missionaries who encountered it in China and wrote home about it in frank astonishment, into the institutions of the modern world. Voltaire wrote about the Chinese examination system with the barely suppressed envy of a man who had spent his career watching aristocrats fail upward. He was not wrong to envy it, but here is what the system did not say aloud and what took centuries to fully understand. The Confucian classics are not a neutral body of knowledge. They are a specific body of knowledge. They encode a specific view of how the world should be organized: hierarchical, ordered, stable, deferential to authority, suspicious of commerce, suspicious of innovation, deeply respectful of precedent. To internalize them fully enough to pass the Jinshi examination was to spend the most cognitively formative years of your life having that worldview pressed into the grooves of your thinking. The men who emerged from the examination cell and entered government were, almost by definition, men who thought in Confucian categories. They evaluated policy through Confucian lenses. They trusted Confucian precedents over empirical observation. When Wang Anshi proposed his reforms in the 1060s and 1070s, the green sprouts loans, the land surveys, the replacement of forced labor with cash payments, the officials who opposed him most fiercely were not fools. They were highly educated men whose educations had convinced them that the natural order of society was disrupted, not improved, by the kind of active state intervention Wang was proposing. Sima Guang, Wang's most formidable opponent, was himself a Jinshi holder, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts, and he was working from premises that the examination system had spent decades installing in him. The meritocracy selected for a very specific kind of merit: fluency with a fixed canon, elegance in applying it to new problems, not the ability to question whether the canon's premises were correct. And there was a second problem, less philosophical but equally consequential. The examination system rewarded the investment of time and resources, genuine, enormous, sustained investment. Memorizing 400,000 classical characters did not happen in a year. It happened over a decade of study, usually beginning in early childhood, usually in a school or under a tutor who had to be paid. The candidates who arrived at the metropolitan examination in Chang'an or Kaifeng were men who had had, somewhere behind them, families willing and able to support a decade of full-time studying instead of farming or trading. That meant families with at least some surplus, some margin between subsistence and comfort, some capacity to defer the economic contribution of a son for years and years while he read. The system was technically open to anyone. In practice, it was much more open to some than to others. A farmer's son from a poor household in Shandong might have the intellectual gifts to pass the Jinshi examination. He almost certainly did not have 10 years of tutored study behind him to develop those gifts. The examination did not ask where you had come from. But the preparation it required made where you came from matter enormously. China developed a word for the men who studied endlessly and passed nothing: fan ru, pedantic scholars, men whose learning had produced no office, no income, no return on the investment of their family's resources. The examination created a class of strivers and a smaller class of succeeders, and the distance between them was not always a function of ability. This is the paradox. A system designed to break the aristocracy, and that did break it genuinely over centuries, could not fully escape becoming a new kind of aristocracy. Not of blood, of study, of the access to sustained, resourced preparation that made study possible. The language was different, the principle felt different, the social mobility was real. But the filtering mechanisms that determined who arrived at the examination cell well prepared were not, in the end, perfectly neutral. And yet the system was more open than anything else in the medieval world, by a margin so large the comparison almost becomes absurd. Europe in the same centuries was advancing aristocrats' sons through church patronage and military title. There was no examination, there was no test, there was birth. The Chinese system's flaws were real. They were also the flaws of something genuinely attempting what no one else had attempted, and doing so with more success than its critics, looking back with modern frameworks, tend to credit. There is one more thing the examination system did, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. It created a logic. It established a premise about how power should be distributed, by capacity, demonstrated through performance, in competition open to any eligible male. That premise was radical. Once stated clearly enough, once built into institutional stone, it was very difficult to argue against without sounding like you were defending hereditary privilege, which was becoming harder to defend in a society that had spent generations watching exam-selected officials outperform their aristocratic predecessors. The logic was a door. Anyone who could pass through the door could claim what lay on the other side. Which brings us to a woman watching from the shadows of the Tang court in the middle of the 7th century, learning the precise grammar of a system that had been built explicitly to exclude her. She is watching how the door works, how the men who pass through it acquire power, how the men who control the examination acquire power of a different and more durable kind. She is, at this point, a concubine, later a consort, later an empress, and later still, this is the thing that should not have been possible but was. Something no word in the Chinese language had been designed to accommodate. She understood the examination system well enough, eventually, to transform it into an instrument for her own purposes. She created the palace examination. She introduced anonymous marking. She opened the process to candidates from regions that the old Northwest aristocracy had dominated and excluded. And in doing so, she built a bureaucratic class, loyal not to the old clans, not to the Li family whose throne she was in the process of taking, but to her, to the person who had expanded their opportunities and elevated their prestige. She used the meritocracy to engineer her own legitimacy. Her name was Wu Zetian. And the question of how a woman not of the royal family, a woman who began her life in the Tang court as a 14-year-old concubine, ranked 5th grade, titled Karen, became the sole emperor of China, is not a question about ambition alone. It is a question about what a door does once it has been built. It opens for whoever is strong enough to walk through it. She arrived at court in 637 AD, 13 years old, ranked 5th grade concubine to an emperor who barely registered her existence. Emperor Taizong had 40 concubines of various ranks, and Wu Zhao, the name she was born with before history gave her the other one, entered at the bottom. Her title was Kairan, talented person, a courtesy designation that meant in practice almost nothing. Court records suggest Taizong was not particularly interested in her, that he found her useful rather than captivating. He placed her in the imperial study. She read state documents. She learned calligraphy. She learned how the court worked, its hierarchies, its rhythms, its invisible architecture of obligation and favor. She spent 12 years doing this. When Taizong died in 649, the protocol for his concubines was clear. They shaved their heads and entered a Buddhist convent, there to remain for the rest of their lives. Wu Zhao went to Ganya Temple. She was 25. Under normal circumstances, that is where the story ends. But she had already been learning the wrong thing to make normal circumstances possible. The man who would become Emperor Gaozong had visited Taizong's sick room in the emperor's final months. The crown prince, Li Ji, the third and least obviously formidable of Taizong's sons, the one who survived partly because he was not frightening enough for his brothers to bother eliminating, had been there when Wu Zhao was also there, attending to his father. Something passed between them. Later sources are discreet about what, exactly. The point is that when Gaozong ascended the throne and the period of ritual mourning passed, he visited Ganya Temple, where his father's concubines had been installed, and he found Wu Zhao. She knew he would come. The account preserved in historical sources has her say to him, with perfect calculation, dressed as resignation, "Even though you are the son of heaven, that you can't do anything about it," meaning her situation, her confinement, the protocol that had assigned her to this temple for the rest of her life. It was a provocation, aimed with surgical precision at the young emperor's need to demonstrate power. He responded with exactly the word she had been waiting for. "Oh, can I?" She returned to the palace not as a concubine of the 5th grade, but as a second-rank concubine of the new emperor. A vertical movement that should not have been possible, because it required that a woman pass from one emperor to his son, violating the foundational logic of dynastic inheritance in which concubines were inherited property, not mobile agents. She had done it anyway. The title, Zhaoyi, did not satisfy her. The court she re-entered in 650 was a landscape she had already mapped. She knew which alliances were provisional, which officials were vulnerable, which women the emperor favored and why. Empress Wang, Gaozong's official consort, had a rival. Consort Xiao, who had borne Gaozong a son and 2 daughters and had thereby secured a position Empress Wang feared. The empress made a tactical decision that she would regret for the rest of her short life. She invited Wu Zhao back to court, specifically to draw the emperor's attention away from consort Xiao. She had imported a more dangerous rival to neutralize a lesser one. Wu Zhao understood immediately what she had been given and moved accordingly. She bore Gaozong children, 4 sons, a daughter. She cultivated the court servants, the eunuchs, the ladies-in-waiting, the minor officials who stood at the edges of power and saw everything, with the kind of attention that powerful people rarely give to people whose information they would someday need. They reported to her. She compiled a complete intelligence picture of the court that no one else possessed, because no one else had thought to acquire it from the people who cleaned the rooms and poured the wine. She was playing a game with a longer time horizon than anyone around her was running. When her daughter, a newborn, died, Wu Zhao arranged events carefully enough that Empress Wang stood accused of the killing. The accusation may have been constructed. It may not have been. The historical record was written predominantly by men who wanted her to be a monster, and some of what they wrote was factually accurate, and in some of what they wrote was designed to achieve exactly the effect it achieved for 13 centuries. The sensation that the darkness of her methods invalidates everything she built. Empress Wang was stripped of her title in 655, imprisoned, then killed. Consort Xiao with her. Wu Zhao became empress. She was 31 years old. She had been at court for less than 2 decades, most of it spent at the margins of power, officially invisible, studying. What happened next was not a usurpation so much as a demonstration that the emperor was, in relevant ways, not the most capable administrator in the palace. Gaozong suffered a series of debilitating strokes beginning around 660 AD. His health deteriorated across the decade that followed, producing headaches severe enough to prevent him from reading state documents, and vision problems that made the daily management of government correspondence impossible. Wu, now Empress Wu, formally recognized, constitutionally powerful by right of her title, stepped into the space his illness opened. At first, she read documents to him. Then she summarized them. Then she began formulating the responses, which he approved. Then, eventually, the distance between her judgment and his approval became so small that it was effectively no distance at all. The court acknowledged this openly. Officials addressed her alongside him. The emperor and empress were referred to collectively as the two saints, a formulation that had no precedent in Chinese political history, a title that the court invented because the existing vocabulary had no word for what was actually happening. A woman was governing the empire. The language adapted to the fact, rather than insisting the fact could not exist. Gaozong died in 683. He had been, by the end, a largely ceremonial presence in his own government. What followed his death was not power seized, but power already held, finally acknowledged. Wu made her son Zhongzong emperor. Within 6 weeks she deposed him. He had spoken, apparently, about appointing his father-in-law to a major position without consulting her, and she found this evidence of an independence she had not authorized. He was sent into exile. His younger brother Ruizong replaced him, a boy emperor kept in the inner palace, never permitted to meet government officials, a purely nominal figure around whom the actual machinery of governance continued to operate precisely as before. In 690, she ended the fiction. She declared a new dynasty, not Tang, but Zhou. Herself not Empress Dowager, but Emperor, Huangdi, the gender-indeterminate title that every ruler of China since Qin Shi Huang had held, the title whose Chinese characters carry no indication of the sex of the person wearing them. She was 65 years old. She ruled for 15 years. The Tang officials who composed her historical record after her death treated this as an abomination. The Confucian historians who shaped how subsequent dynasties understood her, Sima Guang foremost among them, the same man who had opposed Wang Anxi's economic reforms from inside the very ideological framework the examination system had installed in him, wrote about her with the barely suppressed fury of men whose entire moral architecture had been violated by a single woman's survival. She had done the thing the system said could not be done, and the system's defenders wrote the record. Strip away the poison with which the record was composed, and what remains is an administrator of exceptional ability operating in one of the most technically demanding governance environments in the world. She inherited, effectively, the continuation of Taizong's reign, the High Tang, the period of peak cosmopolitan confidence and institutional sophistication, and maintained it. No major rebellions during her rule, which in Tang China, with its vast territory and restless frontier generals, was a genuine achievement. A Tang loyalist revolt in 684 was crushed within weeks. The main armies of the throne remained loyal to her, which meant the public service she had spent decades building remained functional. And the government was administered, taxes were collected, the granaries were managed, the frontier was defended. Korea was brought under Chinese suzerainty during her reign, something no previous Chinese ruler had managed to sustain. The Silk Road remained open. Chang'an remained the world's most cosmopolitan city. The literary culture that would produce the Tang's great poetry continued to flourish, partly because she patronized it, partly because she was part of it. She wrote poetry herself, and the court she presided over understood that poetry was a civic function, not a decoration. She reduced the power of the old aristocratic families with systematic intentionality, not merely as a byproduct of her examination reforms. The Northwest clans, the military and political families who had dominated Tang governance since its founding, whose networks of mutual obligation and hereditary privilege had survived the early examination system by simply learning to produce examination candidates from their own ranks. She identified as structural opponents and broke them, not through massacre, or not primarily through massacre, though there was some of that too. Primarily through the mechanism that Block 5 described, the expansion of the examination system to reach candidates from regions and social backgrounds that the Northwest clans had never needed to compete against. She created the palace examination, the final tier, held in the imperial palace, presided over by the emperor personally, which meant, during her reign, presided over by her. The men who passed that examination owed their careers directly to the person who had approved their success. She also introduced, around 702, anonymous marking for the examination. Candidates' names were hidden from examiners, their scripts recopied by a third hand before evaluation, so that the bias toward recognizable names from established families, the informal patronage system that had persisted inside the formal examination framework, was structurally blocked. She opened the self-nomination route. Candidates could register for the examination without a recommendation from a local official, removing a filter that had quietly privileged men with the right connections even before the examination itself began. Each of these reforms served her political purposes. She was building a bureaucratic class that owed its position to the examination and to her, not to the clans that had run the Tang since 618. Her motives were not philanthropic, and they did not need to be. The consequences, a broader, more genuinely meritocratic system, more permeable to talent from more of the empire's social geography, were real regardless of what generated them. She used the meritocracy as a machine for producing loyalty to herself. The machine, in the process of producing that loyalty, also produced something she had not entirely intended, a more open system than the Tang had possessed before she arrived. The Confucian critics who wrote her record were not entirely wrong about her. She was ruthless toward opponents. The purges of the early years of her sole rule were real. Officials who challenged her were investigated, tried, sometimes executed, sometimes destroyed reputationally through the apparatus of accusation that she had refined into a weapon. The secret police she employed during the most paranoid years of her rule were genuinely feared. The human cost of her consolidation of power was not imaginary. But the Confucian critics were operating from a position that made objectivity about her impossible, because her existence was itself a refutation of the premises they held. If a woman could govern an empire of 80 million people more competently than most of the men who had preceded her, and the record, examined without the filter of their contempt, suggests she largely did, then the Confucian assumption that women were by nature unsuited for governance, that the hierarchical order of the world required male dominance of the political sphere, was not merely inconvenient. It was wrong. They could not say it was wrong. So they said she was a monster instead. The irony is that she was not a feminist. She did not govern as a woman asserting the rights of women. She governed as an emperor asserting the prerogatives of power. She did not remake the court's assumptions about gender. She survived them individually at extraordinary personal cost, by being exceptional enough that the system could not deny her without denying its own stated principles. The door of the meritocracy had said, talent demonstrated earns authority. She had talent. She demonstrated it across 5 decades of court life. The door opened. After her death, it closed. No woman has ruled China in her own right since 705 AD. She chose to be buried with Gaozong, the emperor she had managed and survived and eventually superseded. Their tomb is cut into Mount Liang in Shanxi province, sealed, unexcavated. On the spirit way that leads to the tomb complex, 2 stone steles face each other across the path. The western stele records Gaozong's achievements, inscribed, legible, a conventional document of imperial commemoration. Beside it, the eastern stele stands blank, 6 meters tall, 2 meters wide, carved from a single slab of stone, no inscription. The tradition says that Wu Zetian ordered it blank herself, with a will that read, "Merits and achievements are not. Let the latecomers make their comments." Whether she actually said this is uncertain. What is certain is that in the 12 centuries since her death, people have been unable to stop writing on the stele she left empty. Song Dynasty travelers scratched opinions in the stone. Jin Dynasty scribes added inscriptions in Yurchen script. Ming and Qing visitors added more. and the blank surface she specified has accumulated over time exactly the plurality of judgment she invited: praise, condemnation, curiosity, revision. The stone that was supposed to carry nothing now carries everything, none of it authoritative, all of it testimony to the impossibility of looking at her and feeling nothing, which is, depending on how you read it, either the purest expression of her self-knowledge or the longest joke she ever told. What she proved, if we are interested in what she proved rather than what she did to prove it, is this: the Tang Dynasty had built a civilization whose deepest premise was that the world could be administered by capacity rather than birth. That principle, stated in the examination halls, are proven imperfectly but genuinely in the data of who passed and who governed, contained an implication that the men who built the system had not fully followed to its conclusion. If birth did not determine fitness for governance, then the other category by which people were sorted before their abilities could be assessed, the category of sex, was equally unjustifiable as a criterion. The principle, taken seriously, reached further than its architects had intended. Wu Zetian took it seriously. She did not argue the principle, she enacted it. She walked through the door that the Tang Dynasty's meritocratic logic had built, and she walked through it in a way that was so completely, devastatingly within the rules of the system. She had studied, she had performed, she had administered, and she had governed, that the men who wanted to close the door behind her had no constitutional mechanism to do so. They had only disapproval. And disapproval against a person willing to govern an empire of 80 million people for 50 years from a position she had constructed out of the raw materials of a fifth-grade concubine's title and 12 years of reading in a dead emperor's study, proved insufficient. She was, in this sense, the Tang Dynasty's own argument turned against itself. And the Tang, which had spent 3 centuries building a civilization confident enough to absorb everything the world offered without feeling threatened. Zoroastrian temples beside Buddhist monasteries, Sogdian wine merchants beside Japanese monks, polo from Persia, silk from China. A Turkish-style tent on the palace grounds of the greatest emperor in the world could not ultimately refute the argument, only contain it, one woman, a blank stone, and the question she left for the next century. If the Tang's own logic pointed here, where does the Song's logic point? The Mongols arrived before anyone had time to answer it fully. Before the end comes, consider what the Song was defending, not territory exactly. The Song had already lost half its territory to the Jurchen Jin in 1127, and had spent a century and a half demonstrating that the loss of the northern plains did not break it. Not prestige, the Song had lived with the indignity of paying tribute to stronger neighbors for so long that its diplomats had made a kind of art of the arrangement, buying the time to build the economy that made the tribute affordable. Not even the dynasty in the end. Dynasties had fallen before, and the men who managed the Song in its final decades knew as well as anyone what a dynasty's collapse looked like from the inside. They had read about enough of them. What the Song was defending, without quite having the vocabulary to articulate it this way, was a way of organizing human life that had never existed before, and that would not exist again for centuries after it was gone. The iron furnaces and the paper money and the printing houses, the examination system, the merchant guilds, the ships navigating the Indian Ocean by compass, the cities of 1 million people where merchants argued about prices and scholars argued about policy and poets argued about everything else. Yet the first recognizably modern economy, embedded in the first recognizably modern state, operating in a corner of the world that everyone around it wanted and that none of them were capable of building themselves. The Mongols did not want to destroy this. They wanted to possess it. That distinction matters, and it also, in the end, did not save it. The Mongol Empire had been moving toward China for 50 years before it finally consumed the Song. Genghis Khan had conquered northern China, the territory held by the Jurchen Jin dynasty, in campaigns between 1211 and 1234. His armies had already demonstrated by the time they turned south toward the Song that they could take any city that could be reached and any fortress that could be surrounded. What slowed them in the south was not Song military genius, although the Song had capable generals, but geography. The Yangtze River, the network of lakes and marshes that made the Song's heartland a killing ground for cavalry. Mountains in Sichuan that a steppe army could not easily navigate. The Song had water, and the Mongols did not. For 40 years the Song held, not easily, not without enormous cost, but held. The great Mongol general Khodan probed Sichuan from 1235. Xiangyang, the fortress city on the Han River, gateway to the Yangtze Plain, fell to the Mongols in 1236 and was retaken by the Song general Meng Gong in 1239. A Mongol army drove deep into Sichuan and was stopped at Diaoyucheng, a fortress in the mountains, where it stalled for years. The Grand Khan Munka himself came to direct the campaign in 1259 and died of dysentery or cholera at Diaoyucheng's walls. The kind of death that redirected empires. His death pulled the main Mongol forces north for the succession crisis, and the Song had a decade of relative breathing room. In that decade, the Song made the mistake that may have cost it everything. Kublai Khan sent an ambassador to Linen to discuss terms, peaceful coexistence, the possibility of accommodation. The Song chancellor, Jia Sidao, had the ambassador arrested. He did not tell the emperor. He presented the emperor with a fictional version of events in which the Mongols had been driven off by Song forces. For years, the court in Linen operated on this false intelligence, governing a civilization on the verge of the greatest military assault it would ever face, with a leadership class that had been systematically deceived about the nature of the threat. Jia Sidao was not a fool. He was a political operator of considerable skill, a man who had managed the court's factional dynamics with enough cunning to stay in power for 2 decades while the ground beneath the dynasty dissolved. But he was governing from the logic of court survival rather than the logic of existential threat. And those two logics required very different things. Keeping the emperor ignorant of the lost ambassador kept Jia Sidao safe. It also meant that when Kublai's patience ran out in 1267 and the Mongols came south in earnest, the Song court was operating in a reality that bore no relationship to the one it actually inhabited. In 1267, Kublai Khan ordered his generals south. His target was Shenyang. The city sat on the Han River at the point where the river narrowed between 2 defensible banks. On the north bank, Shenyang. On the south bank, 200 meters away across the water, Fancheng. Together the twin cities formed a gate. Control them and the Han River opened south to the Yangtze, and the Yangtze opened south to everything, to Hangzhou, to the Song's remaining heartland, to the end. Shenyang was the most important strategic point in China. The Song had spent 30 years fortifying it. The Mongols did not try to storm it. They surrounded it. 5,000 ships to blockade the Han River. 5 stone platforms capped with arbalests to control the water approaches. Camps at the key roads. Forts built at every supply route. Then, systematically, the slow work of cutting the city off from everything outside it. No food from the south, no reinforcements, no information. Just Shenyang and Fancheng on their 2 riverbanks. You're watching the Mongol camps multiply and the supply lines disappear. The Song sent relief forces repeatedly. 1,000 men in October 1270 lost. 2,000 in August 1271 lost. 3,000 the following month, mostly destroyed. The relief forces reached the city sometimes. There are records of 100 small boats slipping through the Mongol blockade at night, their crews fighting in the dark to break through. But they could not break the siege. Cavalry on flat terrain was a different proposition from cavalry in the southern mountains, and outside the walls of Xiangyang, in the flatlands the Mongols had occupied. The Song armies had no answer to the steppe horsemen they faced. For 5 years, Xiangyang held. The supplies that had been stockpiled before the siege stretched further than anyone expected. The garrison is commanded by Lu Wenhuan, fought not just as soldiers, but as administrators of a city under impossible conditions, rationing, repairing walls, maintaining the population's will through what must have been, by the 4th and 5th year, a sustained exercise in collective determination that beggars description from the outside. What broke Xiangyang was not cavalry, it was engineering. Kublai had heard through the networks of the Mongol Empire, which by 1272 stretched from China to Persia, from Korea to Poland, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, of a siege weapon being used in the Middle East. The Persian-designed counterweight trebuchet. The Chinese had the traction trebuchet, which their engineers had invented centuries before. Teams of men pulling ropes to throw projectiles. The counterweight version replaced human muscle with the physics of a falling weight, and the difference in range and power was not marginal. It was decisive. Kublai sent to Persia. The Ilkhan Abaka dispatched 2 engineers, Ismail and Ala al-Din, to China. They arrived in 1272. By March 1273, they had built the machines. The counterweight trebuchets had a range of 500 meters and could throw projectiles weighing over 300 kilograms. When the first stone flew over the walls of Fancheng and landed inside the city, the sound it made, the Song Chronicles report, was heard for miles. Fancheng fell within days. Its garrison, having held for 5 years, was overwhelmed once the trebuchets began to work. The defenders who did not die in the assault chose fire. The records say men leapt into flames rather than surrender to the siege that had consumed their city. Lu Wenhuan, in Xiangyang across the river, watched Fancheng burn. He sent a messenger to the emperor requesting immediate reinforcements. The messenger got through. The emperor, hearing of the trebuchets, judged Xiangyang lost and did not send them. Lu Wenhuan, having received assurances that the civilian population would be spared, surrendered in 1273. He took office with his former enemies. His family, commanding garrisons down the river, switched sides when he asked them to. The gate to the Yangtze stood open. The irony that the Song's historians preferred not to examine too closely. The Mongols defeated the most sophisticated civilization on Earth, partly using technology that civilization had invented. The counterweight trebuchet was a Persian improvement on a Chinese original. But the Song's own gunpowder was also in Mongol hands. The Mongols had learned it from the Jin, who had learned it from Chinese engineers, and both sides at Xiangyang deployed gunpowder weapons, fire arrows, fire lances, cast iron bombs thrown by trebuchet that exploded with a noise like thunder and fragments that could pierce iron armor. The compass that guided Song ships through the Indian Ocean also, by 1273, guided ships in Mongol service. And the printing presses that had spread Song culture and commerce across the empire had also spread the military manuals that described Song fortifications. A civilization that had been as generous with its knowledge as the Song, that had traded as far as East Africa, whose merchants and engineers had seeded the Indian Ocean world with techniques and goods, could not expect to be the only beneficiary of what it knew. Knowledge moved. The Mongols were better students of conquered peoples than almost any other empire in history. They hired Chinese engineers and Persian artillerists and Uyghur administrators and Khitan bureaucrats, and put all of them to work. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai founded in 1271 was, in its administrative architecture, and deeply Chinese, because the Mongols had conquered enough of China's north by that point to understand that you could not extract wealth from a sophisticated agrarian economy through brute force. You had to govern it, and governing it required the people who knew how. The Song was not destroyed by savages who didn't understand what they were taking. It was destroyed by a force that understood precisely what it was taking, that had been absorbing the techniques of the civilizations it consumed for 50 years. And that brought those techniques back against their point of origin with a comprehensive efficiency that the Song's extraordinary defensive record could not, in the end, withstand. After Chang'an, the Yuan advance was rapid. Kublai's great general Bayan swept south with an army that included Chinese auxiliaries, Mongol cavalry, Yaos and Persian engineers, taking cities as it went, some after brief fighting, some after no fighting at all. The garrisons watching Bayan's force approach and calculating that resistance was arithmetic rather than honor. Changzhou held and was massacred. Changsha fell. In January 1276, Bayan's forces reached Lin'an, Hangzhou, the southern Song capital, the city that had held the court in exile since 1127, the city whose markets and theaters and printed books and paper money and night restaurants Zhang Zeduan's painting had commemorated 50 years earlier. The Song court sent emissaries to negotiate peace. Bayan refused. Hangzhou fell in February. The child emperor was captured. A remnant of the court, courtiers, concubines, the imperial seals, two of the emperor's young brothers, fled south. The dynasty shrank to a moving point in the landscape, chased by Yuan forces across what is now Fujian and Guangdong, enthroning boys as emperors faster than the Mongols could catch them. One boy emperor died at sea when his boat capsized in a storm. He was 10 years old. His younger brother Zhao Bing, 7 years old, was placed on the throne on Lantau Island, the same island that is now Hong Kong's international airport. The court, still fleeing, still fighting, gathered its remaining fleet at Yamen in Guangdong, a bay on the South China Sea. The loyalist general Zhang Shijie made his final stand. He ordered 1,000 ships chained together in the bay. The child emperor was placed on a ship in the center of the formation. Zhang Shijie ordered all buildings on shore burned, not to destroy them, but to prevent escape, to force his soldiers to fight rather than flee. The last Song fleet floated at anchor in a bay in southern China, chained together, going nowhere, defending a 7-year-old emperor who was the sovereign of a territory that no longer existed. On March 19, 1279, the Yuan fleet attacked. The battle did not last long. The Yuan forces were outnumbered on paper. Yuan sources suggest a ratio of roughly 10-1 in Song favor. But chained ships are not a navy. They cannot maneuver. They cannot retreat. The Yuan broke through the outer ring, then the inner ring, then reached the center. The Prime Minister Lu Shufu, a jinshi holder, a man who had passed the examination in 1256 alongside Wen Tianxiang and spent 23 years serving the dynasty through its long catastrophe, he looked at the Yuan forces closing around him and knew what was about to happen. He ordered his wife into the sea first. Then he turned to the emperor, Zhao Bing, 7 years old, who had apparently watched the battle's outcome and rebuked the disorder of his armed forces, the phrase preserved in the chronicles with the devastating precision of something a child might actually say. Lu Xiufu told him, "The affairs of our nation lie in ruins, and our country is destroyed." He picked the boy up. He jumped. 7 days later, the sea around Yamen was full of bodies. There's a particular kind of historical grief that attaches to endings that were almost avoidable. The Song had held against the Mongols for 40 years, longer than most civilizations in its position had managed a week. And its engineers had fortified Xiangyang so well that it took the best siege technology in the known world, imported from Persia by an empire that spanned a continent, to break it. Its navy at Yamen outnumbered the Yuan fleet. Its court in exile had maintained the forms of governance and the succession of emperors for 3 years of flight through the south of China, in conditions that would have dissolved most institutions entirely. None of this saved it. And yet, the margin between survival and destruction at multiple points across the 40-year struggle was not enormous. Mengke died at Diaoyucheng, and the Mongols left. Jia Sidao had not deceived the emperor, and the Song court might have negotiated terms in the 1260s. The trebuchets had not arrived in time, and Xiangyang might have held another year, another 5 years, and long enough for Kublai's own internal succession problems to redirect the empire's attention. History is not predestination. The Song died by inches, not by destiny. What remains after the dynasty is gone is the question of what was lost. Not just lives, though those were uncountable. Not just the court in exile, the child emperors, the ministers who drowned at Yamen. The economy that had been running a third of global GDP. The examination system that had been selecting administrators by merit for 6 centuries. The iron industry, the paper money, the ships, the Hangzhou night markets where men bought books and argued about poetry until the curfew bells rang. All of it absorbed now into the Yuan dynasty, which would try, imperfectly and partially, to maintain what it had consumed, because Kublai was intelligent enough to understand that what he had taken was not merely territory, but a functioning civilization, and that destroying its functions destroyed the value of what he had fought to possess. The world had not seen this thing before. When it was gone, the world did not see it again for a very long time. There is one more figure who belongs in this reckoning, though he died before Yamen. Wen Tianxiang, poet, statesman, jinshi holder of 1256, the examination class that produced both him and Lu Xiufu. He had fought the Yuan for 3 years across the south of China after Linen fell, organizing resistance with no resources and no realistic prospect of success, the way men act when they understand that the point is no longer victory, but witness. He was captured in 1278 and brought before Kublai Khan, who offered him a high position in the Yuan government. He refused. 3 years in a Yuan prison. He refused again. They executed him in 1283. He wrote in prison a poem called Passing the Lingding Ocean. It contains a couplet that has been reproduced more often than almost any other line in the Chinese language in the centuries since his death. The meaning, roughly translated, "Since ancient times, who has not died? Let my loyalty illuminate history's pages." He was 47 years old when they killed him. He had passed the Jinshi examination at 20, ranked first in the empire, the Zhuangyuan, the highest score in China that year. The examination system had been designed to produce men who could serve a civilization. It had produced one who understood that the deepest form of service, when the civilization is gone, is to become the record of what it was. What that record means, why it was lost, what it cost, and what the listener carries now that they didn't carry when this story began, is what we still have to say. Here is something worth sitting with. Everything this video has described, Chang'an with its 1,000,000 inhabitants and its Persian wine houses and its Zoroastrian fire temples, the 4 inventions, born from failure and accident, and the specific genius of people looking for something else entirely. The Song's paper money and its iron industry and its night markets and its ships in the Indian Ocean. The examination system selecting administrators by merit 800 years before the British civil service thought to try the same idea. Wu Zetian. Wen Tianxiang, the 7-year-old emperor on a chained ship in a bay in Guangdong. The sea full of bodies 7 days after Yamen. All of it happened. None of it is disputed. The historical record is extensive. Chinese sources, Arab sources, Persian sources, Korean sources, the observations of Marco Polo, who arrived in China in 1271 and spent 17 years there, and came home writing things that his European readers assumed were fantasy because the scale of what he described exceeded their capacity to believe it. And yet, if you received a standard Western education at almost any point in the last 3 centuries, almost none of this was in it. The question of why is not simple, but it is answerable. The story of the modern world, the story that Western education tells about where modernity came from, who built it, whose ideas shaped it, is a story with a specific geography. Greece and Rome for the philosophical and legal foundations. The Renaissance for the recovery of classical knowledge. The Reformation for the reshaping of religious authority. The scientific revolution for the systematic study of the natural world. The Enlightenment for the political philosophy of individual rights. The Industrial Revolution for the economic transformation that remade daily life. These events, in this sequence, in this geography, Western Europe, with occasional glances at classical antiquity, constitute what most Western curricula still treat as the story of how the modern world was made. Now, the problem is not that this story is false. The problem is that it is dramatically incomplete in a way that requires the erasure of an inconvenient prior. That China, between the 7th and 13th centuries, built the foundational technologies of the modern world before Europe had the institutional or economic complexity to use them. Gunpowder, printing, the compass, paper money. The civil service examination whose descendants run every modern meritocratic institution on earth. All of it existed in Tang and Song China, fully operational, structurally integrated into the most sophisticated economy the world had yet produced, centuries before Europe developed analogous institutions. If you center China in the story of how modernity was made, at the Western narrative in which the scientific revolution generates technology and technology generates industrial capitalism, a process internal to Europe and driven by distinctively European ideas, becomes impossible to sustain without serious modification. The technologies had already been made. The question becomes not who invented them, but who inherited them, adapted them, and happened to be positioned to benefit from them at the right historical moment. That is a much harder story to tell and a much more uncomfortable one if you are a civilization that has built its self-understanding around the idea that your dominance is an expression of your particular genius. So it was not told, not through conspiracy, through selection. The curriculum is always a choice about what matters. When European scholars began to systematize the study of history in the 18th and 19th centuries, the choices they made reflected the priorities of expanding empires trying to understand themselves. China appeared in their frameworks as an ancient, static civilization, interesting for its antiquity but clearly superseded, evidence, if anything, of what happened to civilizations that failed to generate the dynamism that Europe had generated. The fact that the Song Dynasty had been running paper money and a market economy and a coal-powered iron industry 6 centuries before the British Industrial Revolution did not fit this framework. It was noted in specialist scholarship. It did not enter the general curriculum. It still, largely, has not. What does it cost? Not just China's reputation, which has survived worse than omission from Western history textbooks. Not just the viewer's knowledge base, which is always incomplete and always will be. Something more structural than that. The story you tell about how the modern world was built determines what you think is possible to build next. If modernity is the product of a set of specifically European conditions, a particular religious tradition, a particular political philosophy, a particular form of capitalism, then the lessons it contains are geographically bounded. You can learn from them if you share those conditions. If you don't, you are looking at someone else's blueprint. If, on the other hand, modernity was built first in Tang and Song China, a civilization with a different religion, a different philosophy, a different political tradition, a different geography, then the lesson is different. It was built by human beings working on specific problems with the tools they had, discovering that certain arrangements of institutions and incentives produce certain results, and that those results compounded across time. The meritocracy, the market economy, the state that invested in infrastructure and education, the culture that valued practical knowledge alongside classical learning. These are not ethnically owned ideas. They are technologies of social organization, and they appear to work, with all their attendant limitations and failures, wherever human beings seriously attempt them. That changes the frame significantly. And it also means that the countries whose histories have been most thoroughly excluded from the Western story of modernity, the countries that appear in it only as raw material, as colonial possessions, as late arrivals to a party someone else organized, have a different relationship to what modernity is. They are not behind. They are unaware of a history they share. The Tang Dynasty did not build the modern world for Europe. It built it because human beings, given sufficient stability and sufficient economic complexity and sufficient freedom to pursue problems, tend to build things. The problems it solved are not Chinese problems. They are human problems. This is what the listener now carries that they didn't carry at the start. Not just information, though the information is real, and the dates and the names and the inventions are accurate, and the song's GDP estimate, and the examination system's pass rate, and the counterweight trebuchet's range are all verifiable in the historical record. Not just a corrective to ignorance, the slightly unsatisfying feeling of filling in a gap. Something older than information. The sensation of a world becoming larger than you thought it was. The Tang built a city of 1 million people, absorbed the entire world's cultures into itself without feeling threatened, and produced more great poetry than any civilization before it. The song built the first modern economy from the ashes of the Tang's collapse, and defended it for 40 years against the largest military force in human history. Wu Zetian governed an empire of 80 million people for 50 years, starting from a 5th-grade title in a dead emperor's court. When Tianshang ranked first in the empire at 20, served it for 30 years, refused the conqueror's offer, and made himself into the record of what his civilization had been. These are not obscure people doing obscure things in a corner of history that doesn't concern you. They are the architects of the world you live in, building in a direction that your education decided not to follow, because following it led somewhere inconvenient. Du Fu, the poet who appeared briefly in this story's opening, watching lanterns in Chang'an, reaching for wine he couldn't afford, spent the last years of his life as a refugee, writing about an empire he loved coming apart around him. He is considered by many Chinese scholars to be the greatest poet the language has produced. His reputation in the West is approximately nothing. This is not an accident. It is a choice that was made and kept making itself generation after generation, curriculum after curriculum, without anyone needing to consciously intend it. You have been carrying a story about where the modern world came from. That story has a hole in it roughly the shape of 3 centuries of Tang civilization and 3 more of Song, 6 centuries of the most sophisticated human organization on Earth, producing the foundational technologies of the age you live in. The whole was not made by ignorance. It was made by selection. Selection made by people who had reasons to select, operating in institutions with reasons to approve. Now you know the shape of the whole. What you know, at least approximately, what was in it. That is not a small thing to carry out of this. The darkness outside Wen Tianxiang's prison cell in 1283 was the darkness of a world in which the most sophisticated civilization on Earth had just been consumed by the most powerful military force it had ever faced. He had fought it for 3 years with nothing. He had refused the comfortable arrangement. He wrote the poem that would outlast everything. The dynasty, the conqueror, the empire that executed him, the 7 centuries of silence that followed in the West. Since ancient times, who has not died? Let my loyalty illuminate history's pages. He was talking about China. He was also, without knowing it, talking about you.